He only meant to check the security cameras in the old mansion, after receiving an alert about unusual movement, a simple task like countless times before. Yet what he saw shattered the heart he believed had long turned to stone. For there, standing in the middle of the home he had walked away from 8 months earlier, was Grace, the woman he once loved more than anything, holding a child in her arms. Her hair was gently tousled, her face pale but still carrying that unmistakable softness, and the dim light from the old ceiling lamp fell across the child's features. The eyes. Those eyes. They resembled his in a way that made his breath falter. The same cold, blue-gray, the same deep gaze Grace once said could see straight through a person's soul. Michael Rourke, the man who once ruled all of Chicago through fear and blood, was reduced to nothing more than a silent figure frozen before a screen, unable to form a single word. It felt as if the world around him had stopped, his heart twisting not from pain but from something far more dangerous, something he had tried to bury for months. A love not gentle or comforting but fierce and complicated, a love that cut so deep he had to walk away just to survive it. And now he realized how wrong he had been, because watching Grace cradle that child while standing inside the home where they once planted their dreams, he understood that everything he had done to protect her might have destroyed everything instead. 8 months. He had not seen her in 8 long months. No calls, no messages. She vanished as if she had never existed at all, and now, without warning, she returned with a baby. An innocent life whose every tiny movement tightened the chest of a man who had once killed his enemies without hesitation. Michael lifted a hand, touching the screen as Grace leaned down to kiss the child's forehead, a simple gesture so tender it made his fingers tremble. The anger that had first flared within him, the fury that she dared return here, that she slipped in like an intruder, dissolved, replaced by something far stronger, suspicion and confusion, and a nameless ache that hollowed him from the inside out. That child. Could it be his? Impossible. Yet those eyes could never be faked. He staggered back, the glass of whiskey slipping from his hand and shattering across the marble floor. But he did not hear it. He heard nothing at all except the pounding of his own heartbeat, loud and frantic as if the room itself were closing in on him. Grace did not look at the camera. She seemed unaware she was being watched, or perhaps she knew and no longer cared. She moved slowly, step by step, as if every corner and brick held a memory. Then suddenly she stopped, turned, and looked directly at the lens, directly at him. Their eyes met through the screen, across 8 months of silence and a lifetime of unfinished truths, carrying no accusation, no sorrow, only a strange stillness, as though she too was searching for answers. And Michael, the king of an underworld empire, a man who had watched countless men die without flinching, stood there no longer a ruler, no longer a commander, but a broken man, a man who may have already missed the entire life of his own child. In that moment he understood something no mentor had ever taught him, something no enemy had ever forced him to see, that some truths, no matter how brutal or painful, strike harder than bullets, because they are born from love, and love is the one force capable of breaking a soul once believed to be unbreakable. And if you are following this story, and feel your heart stir with every glance, every breath that passes between Michael and Grace, let us know that you are here, listening alongside us. Where are you listening from? A busy city glowing beneath the weight of its skyscrapers, or a quiet small town where the wind brushes gently across familiar rooftops? Leave a comment below and share where you are listening from, so we can feel how far this story has traveled and whose hearts it has reached. And if you feel anything at all, a touch of sadness, a trace of longing, or simply the quiet ache of something once lost, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, press like, and share the video so that your friends and loved ones can experience moments like these each day. The story is still unfolding, and we will return with the next chapter, more honest, deeper, and no less haunting. Thank you for being here with us. For 8 long months, Michael Rourke lived inside a silence that felt almost frightening, a quiet not born from the absence of sound but from the way everything inside him had simply stopped moving. After that final night, after he turned his back on Grace and walked away through the cold, punishing rain, he believed he had made a clean break, believed that silence was protection, believed that disappearing was the only way to keep her safe from the men waiting for any chance to destroy everything connected to him. What he never imagined was that this silence would be the very thing that killed them both. Every morning he woke in his penthouse high above Chicago, a place designed to shut out the world entirely. Thick glass walls kept the city noise away, bulletproof doors, impeccable security. No one could reach him, but no one could truly come close to him anymore either. He moved through power, wealth, and a loneliness so dense it pressed against his chest like fog. Contracts were still signed. Rivals still vanished quietly. Threats, deals, deaths drifted through his days like routine, and his world continued to function smoothly, as if Grace had never existed at all. But only he knew that every breath he took felt counterfeit. The dinners with untouched whiskey, the cigars burning themselves out on the table, the long hours spent standing before the window staring at traffic lights in the distance without actually seeing them. The nights were the worst, when the ticking of the clock felt like a fist tapping against his ribs, reminding him of every single moment he had thrown away. Many times he reached for his phone, typed her number, then erased it. Each time he told himself he was doing the right thing. She deserved a life free of bloodshed, free of shadows cast by the Mafia, free of danger that never slept. He repeated these words to himself hundreds of times until they became a chant, echoing endlessly in his mind. But Grace had not only disappeared from his life, she had vanished from the world entirely, as if she had never walked on its surface. No one could find her, not a trace, not a whisper of information, not a single friend who knew where she had gone. She dissolved like smoke, and Michael, a man who had once hunted down entire criminal networks, was powerless against the absence of one woman who had once placed her hand over his heart. That silence became the harshest punishment he had ever endured, a punishment not delivered by enemies but by his own chest. His memories remained as vivid as ever, unspooling like film reels he could not turn off. The way she smiled while making tea in the early mornings, the way she nudged open his office door and murmured, "Don't work all day, Mike." The way she sat on the old house's balcony with the wind lifting her hair while her gaze wandered toward the distant woods. And then that final night, the rain pouring down, her standing in front of the mansion door, soaked through, her eyes filled with disappointment. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Protecting you," he answered, and he turned away, never looking back. He believed it was the right choice. But seeing her on the screen tonight, a child in her arms, her eyes free of anger or blame, only carrying that muted sorrow he had seen only on the faces of the dead, he realized that for the past 8 months he had not been living at all. He had merely been existing inside a shell of rotting power. And that baby, that small and breathing miracle, was the consequence of the silence he once believed would save them. But clearly, it was a sentence, a judgment passed down upon a man who chose to walk away instead of staying and fighting for the only thing that had ever mattered. He had already lost Grace, and now he might be standing on the edge of losing the child he had never even held once in his arms. The night he walked away, Chicago felt colder than it should have been, even without rain. The air heavy as lead beneath the dim streetlights that cast pale yellow stains across the pavement and reflected in Grace's eyes as she stared at him, wide and aching, as if she could hold him in place with her gaze alone. Michael remembered every detail: the light gray sweater she wore, her long hair falling loose down her back, her face bare of makeup yet unforgettable enough to haunt him through 8 long months, and the faded wool scarf in her hand, the one he had, bought at a Christmas market 3 years earlier, now worn thin with time. They stood on the front steps of the old mansion, the home that once held their shared dreams, the place where he had promised to walk away from the world of violence and build a family, a promise as fragile as paper caught in a storm he could never calm. When he said, "I have to go," his voice did not tremble, but his heart shattered quietly inside him. Grace did not respond at once. She simply looked at him in a silence so deep the entire night seemed to hold its breath. And then she asked softly, "For me, or because you're afraid?" The question cut deeper than any wound he had ever taken. He was Michael Rourke, a man who feared nothing, yet in front of her he was a fragile human being struggling not to collapse. He answered with a downward glance, staring at the stone step where droplets of night dew gathered silently. "You don't understand," he murmured, his voice tight. "I understand, perfectly," she whispered, her eyes filling. "You think disappearing is how you protect me? You think I need a hero who gives up his weapons, or just the man I love standing beside me?" She stepped down from the stairs and moved closer, until only a breath separated them, lifting her hand to his cheek, and he nearly broke when he felt her warmth. but he could not stay. Not because he did not love her, but because he loved her so fiercely, he could not allow his world to touch her ever again. Only nights before, someone had attached a tracker to her car. A former gunrunner from his crew had been tortured and forced to reveal her name. Her photograph had shown up in the mail of a Russian mobster with the words, "She might be your weakness." He never told her any of this. He only whispered, "If I stay, you will never be safe." She withdrew her hand as though his words had burned everything between them. "And what about me?" she asked, a single tear sliding down her cheek, though her voice held steady. "How am I supposed to live knowing you're out there but never coming back?" And then, with quiet strength, she said, "If you walk away, don't return. I don't need a man who calls disappearing love." He did not kiss her that night, did not hold her. He simply looked at her one last time, and turned away. His footsteps echoed against the stone, like hammers against his own heart, and the door closed behind him without a goodbye, beginning a silence that stretched across hundreds of days while a child grew inside her with no one to stand beside her. And now, as the image of the baby stared back at him from the camera screen, its eyes piercing through his past, he understood that the night he left had not been an ending at all, but the beginning of a hollow existence no amount of power could ever fill. Michael returned to the mansion near midnight, the late autumn wind hissing through the bare branches lining the driveway like whispers from the past. He had not stepped foot here in 8 months, yet every brick and doorway felt painfully familiar, as though he had left only yesterday. The rusted iron gate groaned open with a dry creak that made his heart jolt, and he parked at the base of the same steps where Grace once stood in the rain, watching him walk away without turning back. He climbed out slowly, each step heavy, the wind biting at his face, though the real cold came from the lifelessness inside the house. The mansion was dark, except for the faint flicker of motion sensor lights brushing across walls stained with dust and time. The front door was unlocked, either forgotten by Grace or intentionally left for him. He pushed it open, and a familiar scent struck him still. The smell of old wood, the faint ash of a long-dead fireplace, and somewhere beneath it the soft, lingering fragrance of her perfume. A trace no one else could have left. She had been here. Recently. Each of his steps echoed in the vast foyer past, pictures still hanging in their places, curtains draped in dust, carpets faded from neglect. Yet within that coldness something felt alive, waiting. He walked the long hallway where Grace once hurried after him to remind him that dinner had gone cold, then climbed the stairs with leaden legs toward the east wing, toward the one room he had not been able to enter since the night he left, the nursery. They had decorated it together when hope still lived, Grace choosing mint green walls while he secretly commissioned a wooden crib from a craftsman in Vermont. A crib he took pride in despite never having held a child in his life. He paused at the door, his hand trembling as it touched the knob, and when the door opened with a soft click, everything inside him stilled. The room was unchanged, untouched by dust or decay, alive in a way the rest of the mansion was not. The curtains were half drawn, letting moonlight spill across the room, illuminating the crib by the window where Grace once said she wanted their child to see the first light of every morning. Inside the crib, a tiny blanket lay neatly folded beside a pillow embroidered with white clouds and a pale blue name in Grace's hand. Not the name he had once chosen, but hers, stitched with love. On the table beside the crib sat an old stuffed rabbit with a torn ear, the one he had won at a fall festival years ago, and handed to her with the words, "I don't know how to be a father, but I know how to choose a toy." And she had laughed, a sound that still seemed to echo faintly in the walls. Michael stepped forward and touched the crib's wooden rail. The wood was still smooth and strong, but inside him everything gave way. Grace had returned to this room. She had placed the baby here. No one else knew the code to unlock this room but the two of them, and now it was no longer an empty space holding forgotten dreams. It had been the resting place of a tiny life. He closed his eyes, drawing a long breath as though trying to capture every scent, every vibration still lingering in the air, then opened them again and whispered silently, whether a prayer or a vow he could not tell, that if the child was his, he would never abandon it again. No matter which enemies the darkness sent his way, he would return, and this time he would stay. The scent still lingered in the room, soft and faint, yet strong enough to tighten his chest like an invisible hand. Michael stood motionless beside the crib, eyes closed, letting his own breath mix with the air that still carried the perfume Grace used to wear. Not the expensive fragrances he had bought for her on business trips, but the cheap kind she loved because it reminded her of summers in the countryside where she grew up. Every time she passed by him, that fragrance clung to his shirt, to his hair, to his memories, as if it were her way of marking her presence. And now it had returned, in a silent room inside a forgotten house, as though she had never left at all. But he knew Grace had been here, not a hallucination, not a ghost summoned by his mind. She had truly come back, had stood where he now stood, had laid the baby in this crib, had looked out the window and maybe cried, maybe smiled, but surely had lived some fragment of her old life within these walls. Michael walked slowly around the room, his gaze sweeping over every corner. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything had been tidied with care. On the windowsill sat a small vase of dried carnations, not a flower many would choose, but Grace had once said they brought her peace. Beside it lay a folded scrap of paper with no words written on it, only the faint mark of lipstick at the edge. A kiss. No one but her would leave a trace like that. No one but Grace would be calm enough to return to the house of their past, tend to a dead room, and then vanish like morning mist. He needed no proof, needed no one to confirm it. After all his years in the shadows, Michael understood that when someone came back for something important, they always left the smallest but deepest marks behind. And what Grace had left was no accident. It was a message. She had been here. She wanted him to know. She was not hiding. She was waiting for him to see. He left the room, his steps no longer heavy with doubt, but with a heart too full of things he could not yet name. The hallway lay still, shadows spreading across the walls, yet everything seemed to awaken one memory at a time in his mind. In the living room, he stopped by the old piano. One key was pressed down, and when he touched it, the note still vibrated softly. Someone had played, not long ago, an old melody Grace used to play when she was sad. He leaned forward and saw, tucked beneath the stand, a handkerchief embroidered with flowers. Hers. Michael clenched his fist as his heart pounded harder. These were no longer random signs. Grace had not only returned, she was speaking to him in the only language that could cut through his defenses. Perhaps it was longing, perhaps a warning, or perhaps a test, a way of telling him that if he truly had the courage to step into the world she was trying to protect, he would have to face a truth greater than anything he had ever imagined. And that child, the baby with his eyes, was not just proof of a single night of love in the past, but the beginning of something about to change the rest of his life. He stood in the center of the house, closed his eyes, and drew in a long breath of the perfume still hanging in the air, and he knew, with every instinct honed by surviving blood-soaked wars, that Grace had come back not to run, but to force him out of his icy shell, to start a confrontation no longer fought with power or guns, but with the only thing that had ever defeated him: love. She was there, framed in the doorway leading to the back garden, where moonlight filtered through old branches and turned her dark brown hair almost silver. Michael stopped, at the threshold as if his body had forgotten how to move. Grace turned her head, and in that instant time seemed to fracture. Their eyes met, and a tight, breathless stillness clamped down on the space between them, so dense no words could fit through. She did not speak, did not flinch, did not look frightened or startled. She only watched him with eyes that were deep, questioning, wounded, and unnervingly calm. He said nothing either, his breath caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times, imagined her screaming, or running to him in tears, or turning away without a glance. But now she simply stood there as if she had never left. And he, a man who had commanded hundreds, who had never bowed to anything, found himself utterly wordless. A small sound cracked the silence, a thin, fragile cry like a breeze skimming over water. Grace turned away briefly, stepped back into the house, and when she returned, she held a baby wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. Michael felt his feet root themselves to the wooden floor. The child had a downy cap of dark hair, skin soft as velvet, and those eyes, those blue-gray eyes, like 2 drops of water reflecting straight into his heart. He took a step forward. Grace did not retreat, but her arms tightened around the baby, and her gaze shifted from calm to wary. He stopped, his voice rough, as though it had not been used in months. "Is that my child?" Grace did not answer at once. She looked at him for a long moment, then glanced down at the drowsy baby in her arms before whispering, without a nod, without a shake of the head, a single sentence that shook his world more violently than any bullet he had ever taken. "I think you know better than anyone." Michael turned his face away for a second, as if that unspoken confirmation weighed more than any barrage of gunfire. He dragged a hand through his hair, pressing his fingers hard into his temples, then lifted his head to look at her again, his eyes now filled with all the questions he had never dared to ask. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" Grace narrowed her eyes, as though the question itself was an insult. "Why? Because you left, Michael. Because you walked away and left me standing in the rain with a goodbye that was not even complete, with no promise, without once looking back. I had to stand up on my own, live on my own, bring this child into the world with no one beside me. And now you ask why?" His jaw clenched, anger rising inside him like fire, unsure who it was aimed at, himself, or the world that had cornered him into that choice. "I left to protect you," he said, his voice low and fierce. "If you had stayed, they would have killed you. I did not need saving, Michael. I needed to be with the man I loved." She cut him off, her voice shaking. "I did not need a saint who sacrifices everything and then disappears. I needed you, here, then. And now that I have come back, it is not to beg you, but to show you what you walked away from." She turned slightly so that the moonlight fell fully on the baby's face. The child opened its eyes to look at him. Not crying, not afraid, only the clear, open gaze of a life still untouched by the world. Michael moved closer, then halted. "Have you named him?" he asked, his voice dropping even lower. Grace nodded, very softly. "Jacob. Jacob Rourke." He heard the name like a blade slicing clean through his chest. His surname. She had given the boy his name, even after he vanished, even after he left her alone, even when she could have chosen any other name. She had chosen this. It was not forgiveness, but it was a truth he could not escape. She had not erased him from the child's world. He remained, written into the boy's very blood, and that knowledge hurt him, humbled him, and terrified him more than anything else, because he understood that from this moment on, he no longer had the right to walk away, not when that small, beating heart stood before him as a living, silent sentence he could never deny. Michael stood motionless in front of Grace, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his hands curling into fists as though trying to hold on to the last fragile thread of composure he still possessed. In his eyes, the child sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms was a miracle, a small life born from ruin, the only thing capable of making him, a man who had survived by treading through the blood of others, feel this unbearably weak. Yet that did nothing to silence the turmoil ripping through him, a storm trapped between love, regret, and questions that had never found answers. He looked directly at her, his voice low and rough, like it rose from someone trying to walk through the wreckage of his own remorse. "Where were you? For 8 months I searched for you like a madman. Why didn't you reach out? Why didn't you tell me about the baby? You disappeared as if you had never existed. Why, Grace?" She looked at him, and the anger that had flashed in her eyes earlier softened into something colder, heavier, like wounds that had scarred on the surface but still bled underneath. "You want to know why? Because you chose to leave. Because you put your hand on my shoulder, told me it was to protect me, and then walked away, as if love could survive an unexplained disappearance. You left me with fear, with a night so cold it felt like my bones were cracking, with an empty house, and you expected me to come back and say everything was fine?" He stepped back, his chest tightening as if crushed under invisible weight. He could not find a single word to defend the night he abandoned everything. All he knew was that he had believed he was doing the right thing, that if she no longer had ties to him, she would be safe. But he had never imagined she was carrying a small life inside her. "I didn't know, Grace. If I had known." "If you had known what, Michael? You would have stayed, faced the danger, held me and the baby while a war raged around you, a war waged by the very men you built for years? Or would you have left anyway, just as you always do?" Her question hit him like a slap, freezing him in place. Grace tightened her hold on Jacob and bent slightly, as if shielding him from the storm building between them. He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the baby before lifting them to her again. "I can't change the past, Grace. I can't go back to that night and choose to stay. But I can do something now. I can be his father. I can make things right, if you let me." His voice trembled, something rare and unfamiliar, as though he were peeling away every layer of armor he had worn his entire life. She let out a breath that might have once been a laugh, but now carried none of its warmth. It was the sound of a woman who had loved until she was empty, who had broken until no tears remained, leaving only a faint line of sorrow in her eyes. Make things right? You and me? You think this can be patched up like a torn shirt? You think a few apologies can mend 8 months of loneliness, 8 months of pregnancy with no one beside me, 8 months of bringing this child into the world without his father holding him for the first time, without hearing his first cry? Michael, you don't understand. Not because you don't want to, but because you weren't there when I needed you most. And those moments, no matter what you do, you can never take them back. He said nothing, his shoulders sagging as her words carved truth into him. She was right. Nothing could return him to the moment their son first opened his eyes, or the night Grace soothed him through a fever alone. He had lost those things, and no power on earth could buy them back. But he lifted his head anyway, and his gaze was steady now. No longer the gaze of a powerful man, but that of someone begging for the chance to do what was right. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But don't make the boy grow up without knowing who his father is. If you hate me, then hate me. If you can never forgive me, I'll accept that. But please, don't take away my chance to love my son. Grace didn't answer at once. She looked down at the baby, then turned away, stepping into the shadows of the house, leaving him standing alone as a stranger inside the home that had once been their sanctuary, a place that now judged his very existence with the quiet, unforgiving silence of the woman he had once loved more than his own life. The moment the door closed behind Grace, Michael heard a sound that did not belong there, a sharp metallic click, faint but unmistakable to a man who had lived his life on the thin line between survival and death. He spun around, eyes cutting through the darkness outside the garden. Everything was unnervingly still, no insects, no wind, as if the night itself had stopped breathing. Then a flash of light burst at the far end of the yard by the eastern fence. Michael barely managed to throw himself aside before the Rosso. Living room windows exploded under a hail of bullets ripping through the air. Glass shattered like thunder. He hit the floor, rolling behind the old armchair as his heartbeat pounded against his ribs. In an instant, the house turned into a battleground. Bullets tore through the walls that had once held his memories with Grace, splinters of wood flying like knives. He was unarmed. For months he had stopped carrying weapons, clinging to the desperate hope that letting go of violence meant letting go of who he used to be. But right now he wished he were still that man, the Michael Rourke, who could recognize a threat just by the sound of footsteps in the dark. He shouted toward the inside of the house, his voice rising above the gunfire. "Grace, get down. Take the baby to the storage room. Don't ask anything, just go." He didn't know whether she heard him, but the frantic footsteps down the hall told him she had. He crawled toward the stairs, dragging himself over shards of glass, without feeling a thing, his mind consumed by one thought: they are not touching Grace or Jacob. Another explosion erupted, this time near the back door. They were surrounding the house. They knew he was here. This was no robbery, no mistake. It was a targeted attack. He reached for the drawer beneath the fireplace mantel, where he had once kept a handgun out of old habit, from before he tried to step away from that life. His fingers trembled as they closed around the cold metal. He was no longer the man who killed without blinking, but at this moment, to protect his child, he could become anything. He climbed the stairs with the gun in hand, the gunfire still rattling the rooms below. Every step felt like a battle, not only against the attackers but against the rising dread tightening inside him. Fear of being too late, fear of not being enough, fear of losing everything again. The storage room door cracked open as he reached it, and he saw Grace clutching Jacob to her chest, shielding his tiny head with her hand, her eyes wide in the darkness. No anger now, no accusation, only raw fear she had never shown him before. He motioned for silence, handed her the gun, then leaned down to kiss his son's forehead. "They'll come in through the tunnel," she nodded. "Do you still remember the exit?" "I remember," she whispered, and that was all he needed to know. Despite everything, she had always prepared for this day. He led them to the hidden passage behind the bookshelf in the library, an old tunnel choked with dust but still secure. Once Grace and Jacob slipped behind the steel door, he looked back at the house plunging into chaos, the place that had once been their sanctuary, now splintering into ruins of everything he had failed to protect. And he knew that even if they survived tonight, he would never be the same man again. Because the war had returned not between him and the world, but between his heart and everything he thought he had abandoned. And this time he was no longer fighting for power or reputation or survival. He was fighting for the only thing capable of bringing a man like him to his knees: family. The air inside the tunnel was thick and suffocating, heavy with the damp stench of cold earth mixed with stone dust, and each breath scraped through Michael's throat. The beam from the small flashlight clipped to his belt cast a narrow path ahead, where Grace walked with Jacob held tightly against her chest, careful to make each step soft and quiet. Beneath the thin blanket, the baby still slept, as if in his mother's arms the explosions above belonged to another world entirely. The tunnel had been built in his grandfather's time, carved deep into the ground leading toward the northern woods. Michael had never imagined he would use it himself. In the past, it was meant for the worst emergencies, and now nothing felt worse than the home where he once vowed to build a new life, being torn apart by bullets and fire. He stayed behind them, glancing back every few seconds. Every thud overhead was like a blow to his ribs. Explosions, falling bricks, the crackle of fire eating through timber. The sounds narrated the death of the Rourke mansion. Brick by brick, beam by beam, every memory tied to it was collapsing above their heads. When they reached the final bend of the tunnel, he signaled for them to stop. The iron door leading into the forest was still intact, though its hinges had rusted. Michael lowered himself, pushed with all his strength, the metal groaning in protest, before bursting open to reveal the black sweep of forest and a slap of cold wind. Grace turned to him with a spark of hope in her eyes. But then a deafening blast tore through the air. The ground shook violently, sending all three of them stumbling. Michael whipped around just in time to see a massive crack splitting open along the tunnel ceiling. He shouted, "Run! Go!" Grace didn't hesitate. She gathered Jacob close and sprinted through the misted doorway, her small frame swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Michael pivoted to follow, but the tunnel collapsed behind him, concrete and dirt pouring down like a landslide. Fire from the mansion burst through the breach, sending a wave of blistering heat through the narrow passage. He hit the ground, rolled, scrambled back to his feet, the back of his shirt tearing against jagged stone. The steel door buckled behind him, flames roaring toward his heels. He threw himself out of the tunnel just as the earth split wide, devouring what remained of the passage in a thunderous roar. There was no going back, no way home. The mansion was gone. The house that had witnessed their promises, their fights, their tender nights, their final parting gift was nothing but smoke and rubble. He gasped for air in the forest, collapsing to his knees on the cold earth. Grace was crouched by a tree, wrapping Jacob tightly in his blanket, holding his face against her shoulder. When she saw Michael emerge from the tunnel mouth, she closed her eyes for a brief second and exhaled in relief. No words were spoken. No one cried. But in the faint tightening of their gazes when they found each other in the vast darkness, there was a truth that could not be denied. They had lost everything, yet they had saved the one thing that mattered most. Michael lifted his head toward the narrow trail carved into the forest, a path untouched by cars or footsteps, a place without a name or address, holding only the quiet of souls who had once been broken. He glanced back at the cloud of smoke rising behind them. That was an ending, but it might also be a beginning. He stepped toward Grace and offered his hand. She looked at him, hesitation flickering for just a heartbeat before she took it. For the first time in 8 months, her hand rested in his again. Not out of forgiveness, not out of restored love, but because of one undeniable truth. If they wanted to survive, they had to walk together. And behind them, their past burned in the night, a silent ritual of farewell without a single spoken word. The safe house lay hidden deep within the dense pine forests of northern Wisconsin, tucked so far from any main road and shielded by such thick layers of trees that not even satellite signals could find it. It was a small, weathered wooden cabin once belonging to an old soldier Michael had helped during an operation many years ago. They had long since fallen out of touch, but the key remained where it had always been, beneath the stone beside the steps. As Grace crossed the threshold of the time-worn door, she gently set Jacob down on the old sofa, while Michael moved straight to the kitchen to check the electricity, the water, and whatever food supplies were left. Not much, but enough to survive a few weeks if needed. The fireplace still worked. He lit it with a handful of dry logs stacked neatly in a corner, and the room slowly warmed as flames danced across the walls. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy but felt like a temporary truce between two people who had just escaped a night with no clear way out. Jacob slept on, his breathing steady, his tiny cheeks rising and falling with each soft sigh. Michael sat on the wooden floor, his back resting against the couch, his eyes fixed on the child. Grace sat a few paces away, arms wrapped around her knees, her gaze distant as though she were holding herself together by sheer will. The early winter rain began to fall outside, tapping against the metal roof and window panes, but inside the small cabin the warmth from the fire spread gently, offering for the first time in months a breath that did not feel like suffocation. Michael watched Jacob for a long time. Every small movement the baby made tugged at nerves he thought had long since died. He had seen death, had looked into the eyes of the desperate before pulling the trigger, had tasted the loss of friends, enemies, and comrades alike. But never had he seen anything as fragile or sacred as the child lying before him. He asked, his voice so soft it was nearly a breath. "How old is he?" Grace replied with a whisper. 6.5 months. He nodded slowly, as though each word she spoke stitched together a torn piece of him. 6.5 months. 6.5 months without ever touching his own child. No first embrace, no first lullaby, no chance to witness the first smile. He stood, walked over with deliberate care, then sank to the floor beside the sofa. He looked at Grace, his eyes carrying an apology he did not dare express aloud. "May I?" he hesitated. "May I hold him?" Grace held his gaze longer than he expected. In that moment, it felt as though she was weighing every lonely night, every sleepless hour, every unanswered question. Then she nodded. Very slowly, very softly, as if granting him permission was not just allowing him to hold their child, but opening the first small door after everything that had broken between them. Michael leaned down, sliding his hands beneath the blanket, lifting the tiny body into his arms. Jacob's small warmth melted into him, soft and impossibly alive. The baby stirred, nestled his head against Michael's chest, his little mouth pursing as though lost in a dream. One heartbeat, then another, then a third. Not his alone, both of theirs, woven for the first time into the same fragile space, the same breath, the same unmistakable connection. Michael held his son closer, closing his eyes. His entire life he had believed that bloodshed and power were the only definitions of his existence. But in this moment, with a sleeping child in his arms, he understood that true strength in a man came from knowing what he could never allow himself to lose. And that night, in a worn wooden cabin surrounded by the cold Wisconsin wilderness, Michael Rourke became a father not on paper, not in words, but in silence, with a heart finally awakened, and with hands that had never trembled for anyone until they held his child. The next morning, the Wisconsin forest awoke beneath a blanket of thick, milky fog, each layer of mist clinging to the moss-covered trunks and heavy pine branches. Michael had risen before dawn. He let Grace and Jacob sleep in the small room behind the fireplace while he stepped outside, moving silently like a shadow. Even though this place was nearly impossible to track, his instincts would not allow complacency, and he was right. Not far from the cabin, less than 100 meters away, footprints. Not from animals. Boot prints military style, pressed deep into the wet soil, fresh, likely only a few hours old. Michael did not run. He circled around, slipping behind low shrubs toward the faint crack of a branch, the sound of heavy breathing. Then he saw him. A figure crouched low, holding a small pair of binoculars, poorly concealed but dangerous enough if he had access to communication. Michael moved without thinking. In one clean, instinctive motion, he closed in from behind, seized the man's arm, wrenched his shoulder, and slammed him to the ground in a swift, silent strike. No gunfire, no warning. When the man opened his eyes a few minutes later, he was tied to a wooden chair inside the small kitchen of the cabin. Grace stood in a corner, Jacob held tight in her arms, staring at the stranger as though trying to read who he was and why he had come. Michael did not ask for his name. He simply placed an old dagger on the table and tapped it lightly against the wood. "Who sent you here?" The man gave a crooked, mocking smile. "You know who. The one who used to sit across from you in the meeting room. The one who called you brother. The one who shook your hand after every job." Michael narrowed his eyes, suspicion flickering through him. Tony Mancini. The name came out like a curse, bitter and painful. The scout nodded, the smirk fading. Not too surprised, are you? He knows you've gone soft, knows you stepped out of the game. And when you left the throne empty without a note. You think we'd just let it gather dust? Michael stepped back, as if the name itself had struck him in the chest. Tonith, a brother-in-arms who once saved his life during an assassination attempt 5 years ago, the man he trusted enough to hand over the entire East Division when he walked away. It was him. Michael's voice dropped, low and dangerous. And who gave him the right to come here and kill my family? The man shrugged, blood at the corner of his mouth. He didn't order a kill, just a search. Wanted to make sure you weren't coming back. But if things got messy, bloodshed was inevitable. Grace clutched Jacob tighter, her eyes glued to Michael. He stood still, but every muscle in his body was pulled taut. Betrayal never came from enemies. It came from those once called friends. Tony had once sworn to protect Grace if anything happened to Michael. And now he was the one who sent mercenaries to their home, turning their safe haven into ashes. Michael looked at the scout again. No anger left in his eyes, only the silent clarity of someone who finally understood. He asked nothing more. If Tony had sent someone here, he would not stop. And next time, it would not be a scout. Next time, it would be an execution. Michael opened the back door and motioned to Grace. They had to leave. Immediately. This house was no longer safe. He lifted Jacob into his arms, his gaze fixed on the sun rising over the treetops. Before leaving, he looked straight into the scout's eyes. Tell Tony, I'm not the Michael Rourke I used to be, and next time, I won't walk away. Then he closed the door behind him. No threats were needed. Only a father carrying the scar of betrayal, leading his family through the depths of the forest where life was as fragile as breath but strong enough to kindle a counterstrike born from the ashes. Grace did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. They had trekked deep into the problems, woods toward a small shelter Michael had once used as a temporary hideout during his former life. The hut held only a single cot, a few survival tools, and an old hand-crank radio. Jacob slept in his mother's arms through the entire journey, sensing the tension in the air, crying only briefly before burying his face against her chest. As Michael dropped his backpack and began checking the maps again, Grace sat in a worn wooden chair in the corner, watching him for a long time. In the dim glow of dusk slipping through the cracks in the hut's walls, her eyes no longer carried the resentment from before but something deeper, colder, as though the truth she had held silently inside for so long had finally taken shape. She asked, her voice soft but sharp as steel. How long have you known? Michael froze, not lifting his head right away. The question needed no explanation. Grace stood with Jacob in her arms and walked toward him, stopping just inches away. Tony Mancini. He's the one who helped me disappear. The one who swore he would protect me if you didn't come back. You knew he betrayed you. Why didn't you say anything? Michael lifted his gaze. His eyes were layered with exhaustion from sleepless nights, from years of choosing between love and sacrifice. He spoke slowly, as though each word was carefully pulled out of something heavy. I knew, but not at first. Only after the attack on the mansion, after catching the scout. Before that, I still trusted him. I trusted him because he saved my life. Because he was the only one I gave the East to when I walked away. I never thought. Grace cut him off, anger flashing. Never thought? You're Michael Rourke. You read people with a glance. You've sensed betrayal from miles away. But you didn't see it in him, or you didn't want to. He said nothing. The truth was he had seen signs, unexplained calls, Tony's absence during critical moments, the way he avoided conversations about Grace. But Michael had chosen to ignore it, because he wanted to believe at least one person in his world was still real. Grace held Jacob tighter. Her voice softened, but her eyes remained sharp. I thought I was being protected. I thought Tony was the only one there when you vanished. When I was pregnant, he's the one who took me somewhere safe, who helped me through labor, who kept me breathing when I thought I couldn't. I thought, maybe. Grace faltered, her lips trembling, her voice falling to a whisper. Maybe he cared. But now I see it. He didn't protect me out of kindness. He kept me to control you. Kept me like a pawn. Michael stepped forward, panic flickering in his expression for the first time in days. Did he ever threaten you? Hurt you? Make you afraid?" She shook her head. "No. He never touched me. But now that I think back, the looks, the half-jokes, the way he said you deserve someone who stays, it was wrong from the beginning." Michael bowed his head, bracing himself. Against the window frame, Tony had played the perfect game. When Michael stepped away, Tony stepped in quietly, winning over the loyal ones, erasing trails, and keeping Grace as an unchained hostage. And Michael, out of blind trust, had placed his family into the hands of a traitor without knowing it. Grace whispered, as though confessing to herself, "I thought you abandoned me. But now I see. I was the one who was deceived. Not just by you, by everyone I trusted." Michael stepped closer and laid a hand on her shoulder. "I can't fix everything. But I promise you this time, I'll end it. Not with blood, if I can help it. But if Tony dares touch my family again, I'll show him something worse than death." Grace looked at him, then nodded. No more words were needed. Only one truth stood between them now. The enemy had a name, and he had once been a friend. Betrayal was not just a wound, it was a bleeding mark that would follow them for the rest of their lives, and they would not allow it to happen again. Night fell faster than Michael expected, the Wisconsin air turning sharp with sudden cold as the wind hissed through the gaps in the wooden hut like the murmurs of old ghosts. Grace had fallen asleep, Jacob resting quietly on her chest, strangely peaceful after a long day of running and facing the truth, but Michael could not sleep. He sat on the small porch, eyes fixed on the thick darkness, a dead cigarette trapped between two fingers that trembled slightly. The icy gusts slapped his face until he could no longer tell where the mist ended and his sweat began, and it did not matter, because inside him everything was splitting open. Layers of memory, every choice he had made, every look Grace had given him in the past days, all of it spun through his mind like blades cutting straight into his chest. He had once believed he was doing the right thing, had trusted that walking away was the only way to protect them, to sever the link between his bloody world and the life Grace deserved, but that same decision had delivered her into Tony's hands, the man he called brother, the man he trusted enough to place the life of the woman he loved above all others into. He slammed his fist against the wooden wall beside him, feeling the skin split and warm blood seep from his knuckles. But the sting was nothing compared to the scream inside his chest. Guilt, rage, regret. All his life he had thought he knew the difference between right and wrong, but now all he could see was a twisted pattern of bad choices chained together, carrying him to this place, with a child who did not know what it meant to call someone father, and a wife whose love was now braided tightly with resentment. Michael tilted his head back and stared at the sky. There were no stars, only a thick slab of darkness hanging over him like all the secrets he had never spoken aloud. He wanted to shout, to break something, but then he remembered Jacob was sleeping, and suddenly the fury simmered, away, leaving only a crushing helplessness. A man who had once made an entire city tremble was now hunched outside a weathered wooden hut, unable to guarantee the safety of a single small family. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly like a man on the verge of tears but not yet brave enough to let them fall. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Grace did not say a word. She stepped outside and draped an old blanket over his shoulders. He did not look up at her. His voice came out hoarse. "I ruined everything." She sat down beside him, her gaze no longer accusing, but not gentle either, simply honest, the look of a woman who had walked through the farthest edge of heartbreak. He went on, each word scraping against his throat. "I left without knowing you were pregnant. I trusted the wrong man. I let Tony near you. I let our house fall. I did everything a man should never do. And I do not know if there is any way to fix it." Grace did not respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, as though she were trying to see past every mask he had ever used to hide his feelings. And then she spoke slowly, her voice low but steady. "You do not have to apologize for what I already survived. You just have to live as the man you choose to be from now on. Be a father. Be a man who does not run anymore. I do not need you to be perfect. I just need you here." Michael lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes red but dry. He did not cry. There were no tears left. Only the exhaustion of a soul that had finally realized it had dropped what mattered most in the pursuit of proving itself. He took her hand, for the first time in days, like a drowning man clinging to something solid, and in that moment there was no forgiveness, no grand promises, only two people sitting side by side in the cold night, accepting that love does not always save everything, but can be the only thing that remains when everything else has fallen apart. For Michael, it was the first moment he truly broke, but it was also the first moment he began to rise, not as a ruthless kingpin, but as a father, as a man ready to confront his own past, to reclaim a future for the one he loved. Morning came wrapped in an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself had paused to listen. Pale light filtered through the heavy fog, washing the trees and damp earth in a muted silver gray. Michael woke early, as was his habit, eyes heavy but senses tight as wire. Grace and Jacob were still asleep, curled together under a thin blanket at the far end of the hut. He rose and stepped outside, his hand tightening around the pistol he had loaded the night before. He did not know why his heart was pounding so hard. He only felt that everything around him was too quiet in a way that spelled danger. He followed the narrow trail behind the hut, the one that led deeper into the woods where he had set a few simple warning traps using wire and empty cans. But as he approached, he saw that one of the traps had been disarmed, not triggered, not broken, taken apart deliberately. Michael froze, his heartbeat stumbling once, his grip on the gun tightening. They had arrived. And this time, they knew exactly where he was. There was no warning, no time. A bullet sliced the air and slammed into the trunk beside his face. Then 2, 3 more followed. He dropped to the ground, rolling into the underbrush, eyes scanning rapidly for the shooters. They were closing in. At least 5 men, moving in a wide arc to seal off every path of escape. He scrambled back toward the hut, his chest hammering. In his mind there was only one picture: Grace and Jacob. He had to reach them. He had to get them out. They had to live. Gunfire cracked through the forest like a storm. Boots pounded the ground. Voices barked coded commands he recognized instantly. They were done hiding. They had come to end this. Michael burst into the hut, his face streaked with dirt, his clothes torn by thorns and branches. Grace jerked awake, eyes still unfocused when he grabbed her, shoving the spare gun into her hand. "Take Jacob. Grab the bag. Do not ask. Go now." She did not need to ask. She only nodded, gathered Jacob, who was still drowsy, against her chest, and followed him out the back door. Outside, hell opened up. One man was already waiting, pressed against a thick tree, but Michael moved first. His shot caught the man in the shoulder before he could fire. The scream cut through the trees. Grace ran behind him with Jacob in her arms, her feet slipping on the layer of rotting leaves. The air tasted of smoke and metal. Gunshots splintered bark and tore through the forest like whips. They had no destination, only the certainty that if they stayed, they would die. Michael led her through a narrow break between 2 rock formations, where he had once hidden an old off-road motorcycle years ago. It was still there, half buried in leaves, but the fuel tank was full and the wiring intact. Grace climbed onto the back seat, wrapping Jacob securely in a thick jacket. Michael kicked the engine to life, the roar of the motor drowning out the gunfire. One attacker appeared on their right, weapon raised, but Michael swerved sharply, the spinning rear wheel flinging dirt and stones into the man's face. Then the bike shot forward like an arrow through the trees, leaving behind shouts, bullets, and a patch of forest disappearing into smoke and flame. When they reached the gravel path, Michael did not look back. He knew that if they had been even a few minutes slower, none of them would have survived. The wind lashed his face, branches scraped his arms, but he felt none of it. Behind him, Grace held Jacob tightly, and beneath the howl of the wind around his ears, he could hear the baby's breathing, soft and even, alive. And that was all he needed to keep going, no matter how much of the world behind them burned to ash. Michael dung languri truk do vet kon, laiku tronchin vua ketuk, hoito an vun kongoppa nang nute ka hong jiang kwan an vun dang rong chuyen. Nung deu due nyt kon lai trong an luknai, hong fai la kon jin, kong fai la noi dao tu vet tung rach ervai, malasuket tuk lang le, kumut deu jido, tung duk sai dung bang mau, long tin va ting an em. He had walked away from the ruins of Hawk's Nest, without looking back, leaving Tony sprawled across the polished floor, half-conscious, bleeding, and wearing the hollow smile of a man who finally realized he had lost something far more important than power. Michael stepped out into the cold mountain air, the night wind slicing across his skin as if trying to carve away the remnants of the man he once was. 2 days of hiding in the dense forest had led him here, to this moment, to the coordinates he had received from a source he once believed gone forever, a message containing only 4 words. Hawk's Nest, tonight. Hawk's Nest, perched on a cliff in northern Michigan, had once been their private sanctuary, a luxurious retreat hidden behind the veneer of legitimate business, a place where secret deals were signed and loyalties forged over glasses of bourbon and the unspoken understanding of men who lived outside the law. Now it was Tony's fortress, and Michael had walked straight into it as if he were still the man who owned the room. He had not told Grace. He had simply held Jacob for a long moment before leaving, pressing the baby's cheek against his shoulder and breathing in the soft scent of milk and life, as if collecting something to carry with him into the darkness. He left at dusk, armed only with an old Glock and the dagger Tony had gifted him a decade ago. When he reached the mountain estate, it loomed beneath the thin moonlight, like a ghost suspended between stone and sky. Lights burned bright, cars filled the driveway, guards patrolled the grounds with the confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. But Michael had not come to sneak. He walked through the front doors as if he had been invited, his coat heavy with mist, his eyes dark and still as cold stone. 4 guards raised their guns toward him before a familiar voice echoed from the upper balcony. "Let him in." Tony stood above, a glass of whiskey in hand, every inch the poised, elegant, impossibly self-assured man Michael once trusted with his life. Michael climbed the stairs, each step weighted with memories that refused to stop bleeding. They faced each other in silence for a long moment, 2 men, with a lifetime of unspoken truths between them. Then Michael spoke, his voice quiet but carved with precision. "Why?" Tony's soft laugh drifted between them, amused, almost pitying. "Why? Because you walked away. Because you left everything behind. And because I knew something you refused to admit you had grown too weak to. Hold on to what you built." Michael's eyes narrowed, his tone unchanging. "Weakness is not walking away. Weakness is betrayal. Weakness is using the woman I loved as a pawn. Weakness is sending men to kill the family of someone who once saved your life." Tony placed his glass down and closed the distance between them, his expression neither apologetic nor ashamed. "I kept Grace because I knew you would come back one day. And when you did, you would walk right where I wanted you. I didn't kill her because I respected you. But don't forget, Michael, you abandoned her first. You vanished, and I simply picked up what you threw away." Michael's hands clenched, but he did not strike. He had come too far to let rage dictate the ending. He stepped forward, close enough to feel Tony's breath. "I'm here now, not to reclaim a throne, not to purge anything. I'm here to end it. All of it." Tony's eyes, once belonging to a brother, shimmered now with a hollow darkness. "End it? You think you can walk in here with a few noble words and expect me to yield?" Michael drew the dagger, its blade catching the warm yellow light. "I don't need you to surrender. I just need you to understand one thing: you chose the wrong man to betray." Before Tony could pull his gun, Michael closed in. Their bodies collided, slamming into furniture and marble columns, the room erupting with the sounds of breaking glass, grunts, and the harsh breaths of 2 men who once would have died for each other. The dagger tore into Michael's shoulder, spraying blood across the wall, but he did not fall back. Tony fired, but Michael struck his wrist, sending the bullet ricocheting harmlessly. At the end, Michael drove Tony to the ground, pinning him with the dagger pressed to his throat. Both men gasped for air. Tony shut his eyes and let out a crooked, exhausted laugh. "Do it. Finish it." Michael stared down at him, his hand trembling not from fear, but from something far heavier. Then he threw the dagger aside. "No, I'm not killing you, not out of mercy, but because of Jacob. My son will not have a father who begins again with blood on his hands." Michael rose and turned away, leaving Tony amid the wreckage of his own ambition. And in that moment, something inside Michael Rourkeith, a ruthless kingpin feared by an entire underworld, died quietly, making room for the man he needed to become: a father, a protector, someone who finally understood that true strength was not in the lives he could take, but in the ones he could save. Michael stepped out of the grand hall of Hawk's Nest with unsteady legs, his strength leaking from the wound in his shoulder, yet he never paused. Behind him, Tony still lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, the mark of the blade still visible on his throat, like a quiet reminder of the death that had hovered breath close but never arrived. Michael had not forgiven him. He had simply chosen not to kill him, And that distinction, to him, was greater than anyone else could ever understand. He knew he could have ended everything right there. A single thrust of the knife, a single shot, a single breath more, and Tony would have vanished into the darkness forever, taking with him the nightmares that had haunted Michael for 8 long months. But then Jacob's face rose in his mind, those eyes that mirrored his own, clear and untainted by hatred or blood. Michael had lived his entire life in the shadows, and if there was even a single chance for his son to grow up in the light, he would take it, even if the price meant watching the man who betrayed him continue to breathe. On his way back to the motorcycle hidden in the woods, each step sent a sharp ache through his ribs and shoulder, but he did not feel tired. For the first time in a very long while, he felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because he had chosen the path a father should walk, not the path of power, not the path of vengeance, the path of tomorrow. When he reached the hidden clearing, he saw Grace already waiting, holding Jacob close, her eyes filled with worry and expectation. She did not ask what had happened. She simply looked into him, deeply, as if searching for the one truth that mattered, whether he had killed Tony. Michael gave the slightest shake of his head. Grace did not look surprised. She did not look relieved, nor disappointed. She simply reached for his hand, her grip small but unwavering, full of the quiet trust she still held somewhere deep inside. They climbed onto the motorcycle together, and when the engine rumbled to life again, Michael did not look back. He did not need to. He knew that behind him lay a world that had already fallen, a kingdom of ashes with nothing left worth salvaging. And ahead of him lay a journey entirely new, one in which he was no longer a kingpin, no longer a hunter or a hunted man, but a father, a husband, a man who had learned through betrayal, loss, and suffering the greatest, the lesson of all. Victory does not belong to the strongest, but to the one who chooses love instead of killing. That night they stopped at an old roadside inn near a lakeside town, asking no names, leaving no trace. In the tiny room with its single bed and warm yellow lamp, Michael lifted Jacob gently and placed him between the two of them. The little boy stirred slightly, then drifted back into deep sleep, his lips curling softly as if smiling inside a dream. Grace looked at him and whispered, "You had the chance to kill him. Why didn't you?" Michael did not look at her. He looked at their son. "Because I don't want Jacob to grow up with the shadow of a father who carries one more body on his conscience. I want him to look at me and see a man who could stop for his child, not a man driven by hate." Grace nodded quietly and laid her hand on his chest, over the wound still seeping blood. He had spared Tony, but it was not mercy. It was the choice of a man who understood too well the cost of revenge, who knew peace could never be purchased by one more death. It was the first gift he could give his son, a night without gunfire, a tomorrow not stained by blood. And in that gentle silence of the small rented room, Michael Rourke closed his eyes to sleep for the first time in years without tucking a knife beneath his pillow. Not because the world was safer, but because within that small world he had chosen to let love survive instead of hatred. And that was the real victory. A week after that night at the lakeside inn, Michael, Grace, and Jacob left town before dawn. No one knew who they were. No one asked where they were going, and that anonymity soothed Michael more than any security system he had ever built. They drove north, deep into the forests near the Canadian border, where cell signals were nothing more than imagination, and where the wind and the rustling leaves drowned out the curiosity of the outside world. The cabin Michael sought was a place barely marked on any map, a wooden shelter tucked into a small valley, hidden behind thick pine forests and shielded by a natural ridge of stone. It had once belonged to an old soldier from his former unit, a man who later vanished quietly, leaving behind this refuge like a blessing for whoever survived. When they arrived, the sky had settled into a soft, pale gray, light snow drifting down to coat the roof and worn steps in a thin white layer. Michael stood before the door, his hand resting on the weathered latch, feeling something familiar rise inside no memory, but something he had never truly had before, a beginning. He pushed the door open to a simple but clean space with a fireplace, a wooden table, 2 small beds, a handmade cradle hanging from ropes fixed to the ceiling beams, and a window that looked out toward a frozen lake in the distance. Grace stepped in behind him, her guarded expression slowly easing into a faint smile. She laid Jacob gently in the cradle and brushed his cheek as if confirming that, finally, they had reached a place where they could breathe. Michael lit the fire and sat in the old rocking chair in the corner, holding a cup of cold coffee, his eyes never drifting far from his wife and son. In that moment, every wound, physical and otherwise, went quiet. No gunfire, no enemies, no Tony. Only the crackle of burning wood, the whisper of wind through the window, and the fragile warmth that felt as precious as any treasure. The days that followed slipped by as if time itself had paused. They woke early, before the sun crested the ridge. Michael chopped wood, repaired the cabin roof, added locks, checked the water supply. Grace cooked with whatever they had: flour, canned goods, a few dried staples, and they ate together like a family who had lived this way for years. Jacob began to smile more, his first laugh coming on the third morning when Michael hooted like an owl in his rough, rumbling voice. Grace had looked up from her pot of soup, her eyes meeting Michael's, and no words were needed. They both understood this moment was worth more than all the power they had once chased. At night they sat by the fire, Michael cradling Jacob while Grace leaned against his shoulder. They did not talk much because silence was no longer a distance between them, it was a peace they shared. They did not ask how long they would stay here or try to predict the future. It was enough that when the morning came, they would still have each other. Once, during a storm, the cabin trembled in the fierce wind, and Michael woke with a start, instinctively pulling Jacob protectively against his chest. But when he realized the baby was sleeping soundly, and Grace held his hand firmly beneath the blanket, he exhaled deeply. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they no longer ruled his life. He had survived a long battle, not only with his enemies but with himself. And now, in the cold silence of the deep woods, in a wooden cabin holding nothing of value, except love and peace, Michael Rourke had finally found a place he could call home. Not a home built by money or power, but one protected by his heart and the heavy price of redemption. And for him, there could be no better beginning. The first spring morning in the cabin unfolded under the soft chatter of birds on the roof, the last patches of snow receding to reveal tender blades of grass still soaked with melting ice. Michael sat on the front porch, his bare feet resting on the damp wooden step, one hand around a cup of coffee sending up a thin trail of steam, the other holding Jacob, now nearly 8 months old, sturdy and spirited, with those ash-gray eyes that mirrored his own. The boy tugged playfully at his father's rough stubble, his mouth stretching into a wide, delighted grin, each tiny sound he made softening the forest around them. It was not the first time Michael had held his son, but it was the first time he felt whole in that role. No longer a man running from his past, no longer the kingpin whose name once chilled entire rooms. He was now simply a father, gentle, steady, and present. Each passing day taught him something new about the man he had never imagined he could become. He changed Jacob's diapers with clumsy, almost comical patience, but he never complained. He carried the baby around the cabin each morning, showing him squirrels darting across branches, bird nests tucked into the pines, and soft clouds drifting over a sky he had never looked at properly before. He read children's stories aloud in his deep, warm voice that Grace said sounded like an old song, and when Jacob slept, Michael sat and watched him as though the very act of looking proved there was still something good left in his life. Grace had changed too. The frost in her gaze slowly melted, her smile no longer shaped by burden, but returning to the gentle curve that had once undone Michael completely. They no longer spoke of the past, not because it was forgotten, but because it had become a scar, a reminder rather than an open wound. One night, when Jacob had a mild fever from teething, Michael stayed awake until dawn, pacing through the cabin with the baby pressed against his chest, his forehead resting against Jacob's, whispering soft, shapeless reassurances. When the fever broke by morning, Grace looked at him with eyes transformed, not the eyes of a former lover, nor a woman bruised by disappointment, but the eyes of someone who realized the man before her had truly changed. Michael never spoke of the night he spared Tony, but Grace knew. She saw it in the way he held Jacob, as if the boy was the reason his hands remained free of new blood. Each time he lifted his son, Michael silently affirmed to himself that no power could ever compare to being called father. He had once stood at the summit of a criminal world, with guns and loyalty at his command, yet he had never felt as steady as he did the moment Jacob let out a small, uncertain sound. Pa. He could not be sure. He only knew it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. In the quiet cabin deep in the woods, Michael was no longer a name that evoked fear. He was the man who rose early to warm Jacob's breakfast, who split firewood for his wife, who mended fences, planted small rows of vegetables near the porch, and watched sunsets with the two people he loved most. He had once been a kingpin, once carried the world beneath his heel, but in the end, what made him proud was not victory or power, but what he saw reflected in the unknowing eyes of his son, pure admiration and unconditional love. And in the soft hush of that new life, Michael Rourke, no longer a kingpin, no longer a hunted man, had truly become a father, a man in the fullest sense of the word. Late spring still carried a chill, and the afternoon light stretched across the cabin's window in a pale golden ribbon, falling onto the wooden floor like a quiet silk pathway. Outside, Jacob slept in a small cradle strung between two pines, his round little body rocking gently with the breeze, while inside, Grace sat quietly in the chair facing Michael, watching him for a long while as he sharpened the old dagger dulled by time. Nearly 3 months had passed since they arrived, and life had grown so peaceful that at times Grace wondered whether it was real or merely a long dream after endless chaos. But each morning, when she woke to see Michael holding Jacob on the porch, mixing cereal while murmuring to their child, she understood this was not a dream. They were living a real life. And that truth terrified her. Because Michael had never been born for quiet. He was fire-burning, demanding, always reaching for something fierce, vast, and wild. Yet here, everything was still, gentle, safe. Grace leaned back, her fingers gripping the armrests slightly, then suddenly asked, her voice not loud but clear in the wooden room's hush, "Can you live without fire?" Michael stopped, eyes drifting away from the blade and meeting hers. He did not ask her to repeat the question. He did not turn away. He simply sat in silence for a few breaths, then set the dagger aside. He rose to his feet, walked toward her steady, unhurried, and knelt before her, his hands resting lightly on her knees. He lifted his gaze, and the eyes that had once been cold as ice now held a different flame, one that warmed rather than devoured. "Only if it burns for you." Grace did not look away. Her lips trembled faintly, not from emotion alone, but because she understood the truth of his answer, a truth so piercing it almost hurt. She knew the fire in Michael would never disappear. It would only shift, change shape, but it would still burn, powerful enough to destroy a kingdom if anyone threatened what he loved. Grace touched his cheek, her fingers brushing the faint scar along his jaw, the mark of a life lived on the edge of life and death. And if one day that fire turns in another direction, Michael did not flinch. He tightened his grip around her hands and answered with a voice low and ragged, stripped bare of anything but honesty. "Then I will extinguish it with my own hands. Because now I know there is something worth keeping more than any power or vengeance. Family, you, Jacob, a life I do not protect with guns, but with my heart." Grace bowed her head, her eyes blurring but refusing to let tears fall. She did not need a promise of forever. She needed only one truth, and Michael had given her that. No embellishment, no dramatic vow, just the truth of a man who had walked through destruction to learn how to love with gentleness. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, whispering like breath, "I don't need who you were, I just need you to stay." Michael closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her hair, the smell of pine, of wood smoke, of mornings full of hope. He nodded. "I'm here. No longer a kingpin, no longer an executioner, just a husband, a father, a man learning to let the fire in his heart warm instead of burn." And in that cabin, as the evening light slipped behind the distant ridge, the only thing left was the quiet rhythm of two hearts beating together, and a promise unspoken yet understood. The fire still burned, but this time it burned only for one woman. On an early summer morning, just as the sun rose behind the distant mountains, the first rays of light slipped through the small wooden window of the cabin, washing the quiet space in a soft golden glow. Michael sat on the porch steps with a warm cup of coffee in his hand, watching Jacob take his very first unsteady steps across the dew-soaked grass. Each tiny step felt like a new heartbeat within him, a reminder that in a life once crowded with darkness and blood, there was still room all the way for light. Inside the cabin, Grace was mending the fabric on an old chair by hand, humming a faded tune as she worked. In that simple moment, Michael understood he needed nothing more. Not a throne, not power, not the echo of gunfire or the weight of fear. What he needed was already before him: a small family, a quiet life, and the chance to rebuild everything he had once lost. He had lived for reputation, for fear, for control, but now he lived for simpler things, for meals filled with laughter, for the embrace of his son each night, for the eyes of the woman who had forgiven him not once, but for an entire lifetime. He rose, walked toward Jacob, lifted the boy high into the warm morning light, and spun him gently in the air. Jacob laughed, his tiny hands patting Michael's cheeks, and in that laughter Michael heard a promise. Not a promise to the world, but to himself. From this moment on, he would rebuild his life, not with stone and violence, but with love and trust. A kingdom not made of fear and force, but a home one where no one needed to run, where every wound had a chance to heal. He looked toward Grace, and when their eyes met, the quiet understanding passing between them needed no words. She nodded, and in that small gesture, they both knew the journey ahead was long, but they would walk it together. The story of Michael and Grace was not just a journey away from the past. It was proof of something gentle yet profound. Sometimes we do not need to conquer the world. We only need to find our way back to ourselves and to the people we love most. In a world as restless as ours, perhaps true happiness is not found in grand victories, but in being able to sit beside one another, to hear a child laugh, to look into someone's eyes and speak without speaking at all. And what about you? After following this story to the end, did something within your own heart stir? Have you ever lost something important while chasing after things that only seemed essential at the time? Did this story make you think of family, of love, of the possibility of a second chance for those brave enough to turn back? We would be grateful to hear your honest reflections, your memories, your lessons, your feelings. What comes from your heart may touch the hearts of thousands more. And if you enjoy stories like this gentle, human, and quietly thought-provoking, please remember to subscribe, like, and share so that more people can receive these small sparks of light each day. Thank you for spending your time with us, following a tale that may seem like fiction, yet carries so many truths about life. Wishing you health, peace, and warmth beside the ones you love. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.